Hi people, it's Archivist here, and today I'm going to be reviewing my 16-inch MacBook Pro just over a month after I bought the device. And after something of a rocky start with that really annoying popping sound, since that has been addressed, at least for me, with the Catalina update 0.2, I am really growing to love this thing. I am so glad I got it and so glad I held on to it even though I had some doubts at one point, because for me at least, for the things I need a MacBook Pro to do, it is absolutely exceptional and either meets my demands or just far exceeds them, which is fantastic. Except for one area, and I will tackle that, and it probably won't surprise you, the area I'm going to be talking about. But covering off a few things that were headliners for this, the new keyboard. Initially, I wasn't sure about it because I was one of the few people who grew to adapt to the butterfly mechanisms and actually felt it was quite efficient. But I will admit that I feel as if you can type for longer, more comfortably using this keyboard. And furthermore, because it's far more similar to other keyboards on the market, it's much easier to move between devices. Whereas when I moved between my Windows PC and my last MacBook Pro, it always felt a bit weird because the travel would be so drastic, but now they're far more in line. So I think just having a keyboard that is more of a typical standard to the industry is in and of itself a great benefit. And the more I use it, the more I find myself liking it. And hey, if the reliability has gone up as well, that's great. But there is a disadvantage, and some people have noticed this. The brightness behind the keyboard is perfectly good if you're in a well-lit room, but say you want to start using it at night, you can't get the brightness to go quite as low as the previous keyboards because there was a more precise backlighting system before, whereas now there's more light bleed. And when you're in bed and maybe you're trying to do something quite light and you don't want a heavily lit keyboard in your eyes, it can be ever so slightly disadvantageous there to the previous keyboard. But that's the only real area I think that there was actually an advantage to the butterfly, in that the backlighting was more precise. I mean, the backlighting is nice on these keyboards, but that was one area I think the butterflies did it slightly better due to the nature of the caps they had on them. So that's my thoughts on the keyboard. But as I've already said, the speakers on this thing are phenomenal, absolutely amazing. And when you want to use this as a media center, say watching content on YouTube, Apple TV, Netflix, whatever your choice is, it is absolutely amazing. Because there are plenty of laptops out there that can give you a good screen, but there aren't many that can give you good speakers as well, so you'll often have to use headphones. And while using headphones is fine, if you're like me and you can sometimes have some real marathon watching sessions, sometimes having earphones in the whole time can feel a little bit, irritating. Maybe it's just me, but I do like to just listen through the laptop if I can. Previously, I wouldn't do this just because, again, the speaker quality on previous MacBook Pros and other laptops was very tinny, is the best way to describe it, very tinny. Like, they could get plenty loud, but the fidelity wasn't really there in the same way that it's here. And there's no one in the world I can imagine complaining about the quality of the speakers on this product. I think it is, I honestly believe it's the best feature that they have added to this from the previous. I mean, the 15-inch MacBook Pro wasn't bad at all before. It was genuinely okay. But this is something else. And when I compare it to my 13-inch Pro, and look, I love the 13-inch Pro. I've said it in a previous video. It's a great device, but there's no competition on the speakers, guys. They are so good here. Fan noise as well, thermals. So I can only really get the fans to rev up when I'm gaming. If I'm doing video editing, even 4K footage as you're seeing running in the background here, the fans are completely silent and the device stays really cool. But when the fans do turn on, they are reasonably loud, to be honest. But if you put some headphones in, I suppose you can drown them out, or just, again, turn those fantastic speakers on and it can somewhat obscure it. But when the fans do kick in, they do get quite loud, and there's also obviously a high power drain as a result, because whereas if you're just doing some light browsing or watching a video on the 16-inch, you can get like 7 hours in my experience. I think, do Apple advertise higher? Well, whatever they say, I get about 7 on mid-range brightness, but that's going to go down to like 1 or 2 hours if you're doing some hardcore gaming. Something that's very intensive on the CPU and GPU just kills the battery, and that's the case with most laptops I know. That usually is what happens. It's like perfectly fine when you're doing general stuff, but the moment you really start hitting that CPU and that GPU, the battery life just starts to go, because that's a mechanism in there spinning constantly, plus just the added requirement of the GPU, of course. And let's talk about gaming for a moment there. So I only play one game on my MacBook, and that is World of Warcraft, but it just so happens to be a fantastic test of any laptop's prowess in terms of GPU and CPU. Despite being an old game, they've kept it up to date in terms of graphics reasonably well, to the point where if you crank all the settings to maximum, it can bring even the most powerful Windows PC to its knees. I have 1080 Ti in my Windows 10 PC, and when I run this game at 4K max settings, it really just falls over. The frame rate goes through the floor. I have to bring it down a bit. So this is not a game that is easy on the device when the settings are at the absolute maximum, but you can bring them down to the point where they can run on something very weak. I can even run this game on my 13-inch MacBook Pro if I bring the graphics settings down very low. So it's actually a phenomenal test of any device because it's so super scalable. But I'll tell you what, I was so impressed with the 16-inch MacBook Pro's performance. I could set a mixture of high and medium settings at a roughly 1080p resolution, which personally I think is very appropriate for gaming on a 16-inch or 15-inch screen. And even in some very demanding areas of the game, it held up an almost rock-solid 60 FPS. The occasional dip, but very well. In fact, if you don't play World of Warcraft, you won't know this, but you'll have to take my word for it. When you fly over the city here, the city of Borealis, it is really taxing because there's so much detail in that city as you fly over it, and it's also trying to render the entire world as you're flying through. And on my Windows PC, it typically drops a bit here. Admittedly, my graphics are higher, but I've tuned it here to the point where I think the game looks really nice on the screen, but also holds up really well at 60 FPS. I mean, I'm capturing the footage from a camera here at 60, so you'll notice if you've got an eagle eye any drops, and you'll see that it is pretty damn smooth. Although it does lead me into another drawback of the device, though you must believe me when I say this is not unique to the 16-inch MacBook Pro. It is prevalent across, I think, most of Apple's products actually. I've even noticed it on regular iPads, and that is the screen response time is not exactly where I would like it to be. I have referred to it as ghosting in the past, but in all honesty, ghosting is too harsh a term for it. Ghosting implies you can literally see echoes of images on the screen. It's not really like that. It's more like a consistent motion blur that you see and you can't turn off because it's inherent to the screen technology. It absolutely is there, and when I'm playing a game like World of Warcraft, I definitely notice it as opposed to my 4K ASUS screen. Like, it's really obvious, but I wouldn't necessarily call it a problem. It just gives it a bit of a different look. I do, however, wish that Apple, for their next devices, would look into improving the screen response time so that we don't notice that. I think that's the one area of the screen I would encourage Apple to take a look at and try and improve. In terms of color reproduction, in terms of resolution, it's already got everything it needs. I've heard some people say, it's not even a 4K screen. You don't need a 4K screen on this. The pixels are more or less indistinguishable unless you're going right up to the screen like a maniac and trying to count them with a magnifying glass. At a normal viewing distance, this resolution is fine. The color reproduction is amazing with the P3 gamut. So it's just the screen response time that I believe Apple should look at next. So in terms of video editing, it will be a surprise to absolutely no one that the 16-inch MacBook Pro is amazing. You can easily edit 4K 60 FPS footage and not even see a single stutter in the preview window. It really just handles this as if it was 720p. It flies through it with no issues at all, and the fan doesn't turn on until I start exporting videos. So it does it quietly, coolly, super effective, and to be honest guys, super overkill. If you want to edit some smaller like 10-20 minute videos, put some audio over the top, cut the footage up, put some transitions in, if you want to save yourself a bit of money, you can do that just as well on a 13-inch MacBook Pro. The only reason that I would naturally gravitate towards editing on my 16-inch over my 13-inch, to be honest, is because of the screen size, which is the obvious benefit, because extra screen real estate will just make it easier to edit on, right? So if you have an external monitor, to be honest, again, if you're just looking to save a bit of cash, I would be looking towards the 13-inch because, yes, the 16-inch is amazing at video editing, but it's more than I think most prosumers. And prosumers, by the way, are the people I'm really talking to here because I'm a prosumer. I'm not really a true pro user. Prosumers will find this absolutely overkill. So if you have a bit of a budget, do not feel bad at all if you're looking at the 13-inch because it's also a very capable device. I think you can even edit well on the MacBook Air, but as I do not own one, I won't say that with total confidence. I just assume you can because I remember owning a 12-inch MacBook and that was okay, and the Air is a step above that, so there you go. Get it if you want, but I tell you guys, it's so good, it's borderline overkill. By no means a criticism, of course, just something to keep in mind. So on my final miscellaneous points, I should mention that although for me, the really irritating popping sound I had when I first got the product that was patched with 10.15.2 and is no longer an issue for me, I have heard from many people that even after 10.15.2, they still have the problem. And that is not acceptable on a product of this price. Now what that means is it must be now an intermittent issue. So if you get the product and you still have it, make sure you return it and get one without it because you should not accept such an outrageous oversight on such an expensive product. Just don't even think about it, just return it and get a better one because it's a lot of money and you don't want to get a compromised unit in my opinion. Also something, yes, this device is heavier and it is a bit thicker. Now, I am 1000% okay with this because it's a MacBook Pro, it's not a MacBook Air, and it needs room to breathe, to have a big battery, to have that superior keyboard with the scissor switches. There was a time, I think, where Apple were just obsessed with getting everything in their product line to be as thin and light as possible. And look, thin and light is great, makes things so much easier to move around, and laptops are portable computers, so they should have an element of portability, but when you have a MacBook Air in your lineup, the selling point of which is that it should be the thin and light alternative, there's no point really also trying to make the MacBook Pro ultra thin like they did with the last 15-inch. So the fact it's just a tiny bit thicker and a tiny bit heavier is really of little concern for me. And I think that's especially true if many years ago now you had to live with the 15-inch unibody because that thing was very thick and very heavy, and yet if you could live with that, then this thing is super light and super thin in comparison to that. So in reality it's all relative. And those are for now my final thoughts on the MacBook Pro 16-inch. So as always people, thanks very much for watching and see you next time.